The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers nor Rogers TV.
Hi, I'm David Shearman. Welcome to Politically Speaking. Politically Speaking is a program where we talk with many of our political and community leaders about issues of the day, and it's a chance to perhaps go a little deeper than you might otherwise find in some other places. My guests today are Dave Trumble and Chris Stephen of the Grey Bruce Labour Council. Dave is Vice President for Bruce County, and Chris is the President of the Grey Bruce Labour Council. And we're coming back to something that we have talked about before, and it is the National Day of Mourning, which will be on April 28th. And I don't want to use the word celebrate, because I think it's much better for us to say it's a day of remembrance for those who have died in workplace accidents. So Dave and Chris, welcome. Welcome back. Good to see you both again.
Thanks, David. Much appreciated.
Yes, thank you.
Now, the National Day of Mourning has got a bit of a history to it, but where did it start?
Actually, I think it's important for Chris to have a bit of an introduction here, because Chris being an elected official actually within CUPE, because it was actually the genesis within CUPE that started it all. So, Brother Chris, I'm going to ask you to start that off, and if you let me, I'll fill in the blanks.
Absolutely. So, the National Day of Mourning was actually started by two activists, Colin Lambert and Ray Sentes. And they were stopped in the middle of a road waiting for a funeral procession for a fireman that died on the site. And they decided at that point that there should be a remembrance day for workers that are killed annually, because there are even now there's lots of workers killed and injured in the workplace. So the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, passed a resolution in 1983 to remember it as the National Day of Mourning, and that was followed by the Canadian Labour Congress, actually. So at that point, it became an annual event.
What's important in that too is to not forget that about 1991, the Canadian government recognized it. Although it's an observance, a commemoration, as you said, David. It's not a day where we celebrate, but it was a day that the government recognized officially.
Yes, and I think it's important that we remember that is a commemoration. It's not a public holiday, it's not a stat holiday, it's nothing like that, but it is a time for observance. And it's particularly poignant to those who are working in sometimes dangerous lines of work. But what we've thought has been relatively safe work has become redefined in this time of COVID, and we'll talk a bit about that a little bit later. But I remember the last time we talked about this, you were planning a remembrance parade, if I'm not mistaken, and obviously COVID restrictions have kind of changed that. So what is the plan for the commemoration here in Grey Bruce?
I'll start off a bit, David. What we've done, clearly, because of the most recent situation, we did back away from anything in person. It seemed counterintuitive on a day when we want to remember workers that have been killed, injured, and made sick in the workplace to expose the public and our colleagues, sisters, and brothers to the potential of some form of illness related to COVID. So what we've done is we've taken a step into the virtual world, a step up. 2020 saw us do some virtual work. But we've taken a step up. We've certainly got videos coming from all the executive, which will be posted on social media. We're pushing a number of our municipalities who will undertake to fly the Canadian Labour Congress Day of Mourning flag at half staff on the 28th. And I believe we've got 3 communities committed, and pending a 4th. I'm waiting for my own community, Kincardine, to give me the thumbs up or thumbs down. And I'm obviously optimistic there'll be a thumbs up. And this, of course, connects to a vast number of larger scale virtual ceremonies being held from coast to coast by labor councils, unions, general labor organizations, and really a big push to make sure that despite what COVID has done to us, that we will not allow April 28th to slide away unmarked.
What are some of the, aside from social media presence, so there will be no public commemoration other than flags flying at half-mast, is that right?
What I will tell you is that we also have a social media presence, as well as I don't know if the right term, the conventional media. We have taken a strong initiative to purchase advertising space, and we've been very fortunate with we have great media allies or great media supporters in both counties. They've helped us to put together some excellent verbiage. Plus, they've done interviews, which they're playing on a regular basis. And in turn, there'll also be some print. Our press release for Day of Mourning goes out on Monday, which is our next general meeting for the Labor Council, just to make sure that everybody agrees with the press release. So we are pushing as much as we can out. And of course, like I say, nationally, and I know that Chris being, like I say, associated with CUPE to the level that he is, he'll be able to give you a very clear insight into how huge the CUPE presence will be on this day as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you go to the CUPE website, and virtually any website at this time, because pretty much all the labor unions have jumped on, it will give you so much information on the Day of Mourning and what it's about. I went onto their page this morning just to look up a few things, and all the statistics are there. Like, CUPE does a lot of research behind this and make sure everybody's updated and make sure they put out accurate information every year. There's a lot of push and a lot of support from CUPE on this because, like I said, they were the originators back in 1983, so it's something near and dear to our heart. But something Dave said it, but I want to make sure we give them proper kudos here, is the City of Owen Sound, the municipality of Erin Elderslie, and the municipality of Brockton, if I'm correct, Dave, have all agreed to fly the flag this year. That is huge for us. That shows that we're starting to get more community support, and I'll challenge any municipal council that if they want to get involved and do anything moving forward for the Day of Mourning, a flag or whatever, we can help them out, we can get them involved, and just come to us. We're willing to help and work with anybody. It is so important to labor that we remember this day, because the statistics around this are staggering, and we need to bring more awareness to what it's about.
Yes. Now, those flag flyings will simply be the flag being flown on that day. Often there is a municipal ceremony that goes along with that. So I presume that's not going to happen because of social distancing and restrictions on gathering. But it'll be good to see the flag as a sign of remembrance, and I certainly will look forward to it and look to see it here in Owen Sound, because there is, for those who don't realize it, there is a special flagpole just on the south end of City Hall, right at the corner of 2nd Ave East and 8th Street. So have to look for that. There's not always a lot of flags there, but certainly on this occasion there certainly will be. That's good to hear.
Perhaps, Dave, I could just before we leave that topic, I think it's worth noting the largest Day of Mourning observance under pre-COVID conditions, and again, hopefully post-COVID conditions, has always been the observance and ceremony at the Bruce Power site. We end up with 200 to 300 people in attendance, and although the Labor Council chairs the event, it's recognized as a day that had its genesis in labor, but of course has grown well beyond that boundary. But Bruce Power has always been Ontario Hydro, OPG, now Bruce Power has always been a very magnanimous host. And what they've done is they've taken an initiative this year. They realize they can't do that type of gathering, so what they're doing is they've actually got myself as a representative of labor and Mike Renchek as their CEO. We're the two voices that have showed up on their monthly safety meeting video. And then, of course, they have all the rest of the stuff that's been added in through WSIB and MLTSD, et cetera. So they've really worked very hard to sustain the momentum behind the day.
Yeah, you mentioned WSIB there, Dave. One of the things I have noticed is that there is an increased presence in the traditional media, in television, and also on social media by the WSIB. and it's very, very clear. This is the theme is National Day of Mourning, and it's very blunt. It's very, it recognizes the seriousness of the occasion, and I'm thinking this is a really interesting development because I don't recall that level of involvement by WSIB, although obviously they're involved. I don't recall the level and of their involvement, and the quality of production is absolutely superb.
It's a bit of a continuum, David. I've been presenting to secondary school students for a long time out of a talking union program, which of course has a large component of health and safety in it. And I've been able to pull in sort of incrementally over the years more and more WSIB stuff as they've upped their game. And I think there's probably two legs to that. One, they recognize that prevention is far more valuable than remediation after the fact. So the more message we get out there, the better. But I also, although I have no direct line of sight to it, I cannot help but believe that their relationship with My Safe Work, Rob Ellis's organization, has also pulled them into a much more front runner position on that. Because not to get into the whole story of Rob's situation, but his young son David was killed in a workplace incident in the late 1990s on the second day of the summer job, and Rob has dedicated his life to young workers since then. And I think his relationship with the WSIB has pushed them into a much more proactive stance.
Yeah. One of the things I've also noticed, and I suspect it may be cultural, although I could be wrong. I happen to be a great fan of some of those paramedic shows, those reality kind of shows. And there's one currently running on the documentary channel simply called Paramedics, but it's Australian. And the difference between that and the American shows and Canadian shows, even because there are some Canadian ones, is quite remarkable. Believe it or not, recently one of the shows actually showed an industrial accident. Not a car crash, not a shooting incident, not a drug overdose, an industrial accident where a young man, and it's second day on the job, he was 18, just first job, going to feed his family. He had, I don't know, goodness knows how many kids and a wife, and he was severely injured in some kind of machinery accident, and it was awful. And of course, they go through all the steps of the immediate emergency. But what was really interesting is at the end, they always do this little summary of the show. And you kind of see, okay, a few months later, where are these people? And often they like to show really positive images of people who have recovered and everybody's happy. Not in this case. This young man at the age of 18, because of an industrial accident, had gone through some horrendous number of surgeries, something like a dozen surgeries, was still unable to work, and still had not returned to mobility, did not have anywhere near the ability and mobility of his arm, because that was the part of his body that was involved. And it was all both on one hand very poignant, but on the other hand a wake-up call. That's a reminder for people. But we don't see that in our North American television for whatever reason. So it's maybe it's a cultural thing. I just don't know. But workplace accidents do have a place in our society, in our community, and they affect people just as much as some of the more tragic situations that we see. And I'm not trying to make light of any of them. I'm just saying that they are part of our experience, and certainly part of the emergency medicine scene.
If I could speak to that for a second, Dave, that's one of the reasons why I think the Day of Mourning is so crucial and so vital, because the more social media, the more TV we can get on it now, the more the younger generation is going to find out that these things do happen when you get out of school. There needs to be something real put behind it, so they know that health and safety needs to be something they focus on when they enter the workforce. And so this is one of those days when we can really educate young people that this is something that you are going to face. And it doesn't matter. Like, sure, the day of mourning is a union led, but if you're a worker, you're a worker. You can, every day you go to work, something could happen, a fatal injury. You could catch a disease like COVID now, death. It's just so much more common. And so the more social media that we can get behind this, and this is why we are grateful to Rogers, because this is the second year or third year now you've had us on to talk about it. It's important to get this information out. And I think it's actually something that kids in high school should have classes on when they start shop classes, etc. That, some health and safety classes should be thrown in there, because as soon as they're in the workplace, right now they know very little. It needs to be taught so they understand.
Chris, it's funny you should say that, because, and here I go, I'm the old fossil. I've been around for a long time, and I remember shop classes. In fact, in my high school career, curiously, I spent 4 years doing shop, because you could do that in high school. But what was really intriguing was, and that you've brought that memory back to me, we got, first day one, we got the safety briefing, we got the safety films, and some of them were pretty gross, but I don't know whether you ever saw those, Chris, or Dave, you probably remember those films.
Yeah, they were 35 millimeter films or something. But it's funny you bring that up. My father was a supervisor, and sorry, I have a guest in my back picture there. Sorry,
That's all right.
And anyways, the situation was he was preparing for a safety meeting, and he brought the video or the film home to run it before he did the meeting, and he asked me to come sit and watch it with him. And like yesterday, I have that vision of the man entangled in the printing press.
Uh-huh.
And it was all about making sure that equipment was locked and tagged out and de-energized before work commenced. And you know what, David, Chris, that man's face, that man's contorted figure is as clear in my mind today as it was the day that I saw that when I was probably 10 or 11 years old.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I still remember the very graphic pictures. That was the IAPA, the Industrial Accident Prevention Association. They were the ones who did that kind of work, and we were working. Our attention as teenage boys, our attention was grabbed. Oh, okay. And you always made sure that the sleeves were buttoned up, that everything was tight, and your machinery was clear before you started things up. It was absolutely essential. You have to wonder today whether that same awareness is around. It's funny, even when if you go out and get into your car, do you walk around your car to check to see the tires are inflated, or you haven't had a flat, or are your mirrors okay? All just safety awareness.
Yes, David. When I worked, of course, say in utility business, you're forever on the road. I mean, I know Chris is in the same situation. He's forever on the road. He's forever getting in and out of a vehicle. The idea of a circle check.
Mm-hmm.
Check the tires, check that there's windshield washer fluid in there, check that the lights work, that the signals work. Though I had a supervisor one time said to me, if he had one wish in the world of health and safety, is that every single worker that worked for him would spend 30 seconds before they walked into any workspace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. And Chris, I'm sure you working as a municipal worker see the same thing. You've got to be careful. You've got to be I trust it's drilled into you that you walk around your truck and you assess your work site to make sure it's safe to work on.
Well, exactly. Every morning, it's the first thing you do is when you're going out to a job site, you try to focus on what are the safety factors we need to take into consideration before we go out there. What clothing do we need? What equipment do we need? What are we using? How do we set it up? Like, that all has to be gone over. And I know I've heard before some people talk about how their health and safety rules in their workplace, and they say things like, oh, that's a stupid rule. Well, you know what? Rules are in place for a reason. And for every rule, there was an accident that happened that nobody thought would happen, or an injury that happened, or a death that happened that nobody thought would happen. And they're like, well, let's learn from it let's make a rule going forward. And that's why we got the green book now that has all the health and safety rules in it to make sure you're safe at the workplace. So, and like I said, the day of mourning, that's what we focus on, and we need the awareness, because I know before I was a worker, and even as I started in the municipality, I did not know what the day of mourning was, and it's been around forever. But through my union work, I've come to learn about it, and I would like to see kids start learning about it earlier, because it just clicks that on there that, you know, it can happen, and it can happen in a heartbeat. It's that fast.
One of the things that I think people may or may not realize, and I suspect they don't, and I didn't realize this until I was, I actually talked to some people who worked for, well, then it was Ontario Hydro, but the same is true of the gas companies. You wonder why, oh, gee, there's a bunch of people standing around observing that job. Well, in the case of Hydro One, there is a safety person who stands back and watches and keeps an eye, particularly when working on high lines and high voltage lines. There is always someone who steps back to make sure that the site is safe or the work is safe. And if there's an emergency, it knows exactly what to do.
You hit the nail right on the head, and in fact, it's a requirement. Chris mentioned, the Green Book, the Occupational Health Safety Act, and the regulations that support it. When you have someone working at heights, when they are elevated, it is a requirement to have a person on the ground to be a dedicated observer. And when I say a dedicated observer, that doesn't mean looking at your phone. It doesn't mean checking out the wildlife and the flora and fauna. That means eyes on the person who was working above your head, just for those very reasons. And I mean, I have a story of my early days when I was a Power Workers Health and Safety Staff Officer, and how that presence of mind in that situation saved an individual's life. The person was working in proximity, didn't get onto the high voltage line, but the high voltage line was 200,000 or 300,000 volts, but they were working on another line in close proximity, and there was enough inductance from that high voltage line that the line he had his hands on livened up. The individual made an error, there was an error in the procedure, whatever, doesn't matter. Somehow or another, he came onto that line. He now was physically locked on, he couldn't let go. The man on the ground knew the way to get him down was to slowly lower the bucket, because he was strapped in the bucket, and eventually the bucket and the strap in the bucket would force his hands open and get him off that line. Talk about dramatic, but talk about presence of mind and a clear manifestation of why that person on the ground, a skilled, trained person on the ground, is a lifesaver.
Right. I remember many, many years ago, a farm accident that happened to someone that I knew. And of course, it was an innocent cause. There was a cat on up on a hydro pole or power pole. Instead of calling the electric company, the farmer decided, well, I better go up and get the cat. So he took an aluminum ladder, went up the pole, and what he didn't realize is because of the wetness of the ground, which was sand, he was sticking basically his aluminum ladder into water. He went up the pole, or up the ladder on the pole. The cat, believe it or not, jumped down and survived, but just as he got to the top, the ladder slipped, contacted a high voltage line, and he was frozen. Fortunately, his son was close by, saw what had happened, and being the great Husky football player he was, went straight for the ladder, using his shoulder, pushed the ladder away, broke the contact. His father fell to the ground, and when all was said and done, he was 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from burns and some broken bones from the fall. But when they measured the ladder, the arcing of the ladder had shortened it by 18 inches. And I have got as a reminder, I went out to the site, and I picked up a piece of blackened glass, what looks like blackened glass. It's silica, which is what aluminum breaks down into when it's arced. And that's a reminder to me that You don't play with power lines. You don't go chasing cats up power poles. There are trained people who can fix that, who can respond to that. And not even the fire department does that anymore. It's power workers that do that,
And I think, we talked a little earlier on about getting out ahead of stuff, the versus the reactive posture when we're trying to, remediate something, someone's been hurt. Nowadays, people would not climb up a pole to make a rescue using a live line. You would if there was work being done that created a situation where you had to do something with live line work, there would be a detailed procedure. The rescue procedure would not commence until the power was turned off.
Yeah. So I think we've all got those kinds of stories, and I'm sure you both have a lot more. But let's switch it a little bit to talk a bit about the people. No, let's leave that for after the break, because I know we're coming up on the break. One of the things that I think that is interesting, I was doing a little rooting around, as I always do before the show, and I went to the Ministry of Labour website, and this is the government of Ontario, and I discovered they've got quite a list of industrial accidents. Variety of ones, including, perhaps you may remember the helicopter crash where people who were quite close to people here in Grey and Bruce counties with Hydro One were killed. And the ministry has not updated its incident website since August 2018. So that's almost 3 years of industrial accidents. And please don't try and tell me there have been no industrial accidents in Ontario in the last 3 years.
There hasn't been. There's been just as many in 2019 as there was in 2018, et cetera, et cetera. So no, it's not like the statistics don't exist. That is for sure. I sure have no idea why the ministry site's not updated. But I think I can tell you though that thankfully, to my knowledge, the statistics do show up as being relatively current on the WSIB website.
So what is the situation in terms of incidents? Are we talking a large number, small number? I mean, Chris, you before the show you were talking about some American statistics that are absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah, the American statistics. So, and like you said when we were pre-talking there, is if you take 10% of that, that's probably Canada. So 540 work injuries per hour, 12,900 work injuries per day, 90,400 work injuries per week, and 7 million work injuries per year. That's the American statistics that I could find by trying to poke around and do a Google search. And like we pointed out, the 10% is probably accurate in Canada. I also did some digging on CUPE's website, and in the last year, CUPE has lost 14 members across Canada. So one is too many. And I do know, and it doesn't list it, but I do know some of those were COVID-related workplace losses. So those are staggering numbers, because that's just one working organization that has lost 14 members in a year. So it's worrisome.
For sure. Well, we're going to take a break, and I want to come back and discuss a lot of other issues around this, which are certainly part of the whole matrix of the day of mourning. So we'll be back in a very brief time. Friends, I'm David Shearman, and this is Politically Speaking.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
It's hard to believe it's been 10 years since the Owen Sound attack shocked the junior hockey world by winning the Ontario Hockey League Championship. But get ready to relive that moment on Rogers TV. Join me, Manny Pava, as I host a special edition of Attack Wrap with members of that 2011 championship team. It will air after we rebroadcast all 7 games of the 2011 OHL Final, beginning on May 9th and ending on May 15th. The exact date of that thrilling 3-2 overtime victory in Game 7 over Mississauga's St. Michael's Majors. Celebrate the Attack OHL Championship once again with Rogers TV.
Hi, I'm David Shearman, host of Politically Speaking. Join me for my next show where I will be talking with the Grey Bruce Labour Council. Politically Speaking on Rogers TV.
The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers nor Rogers TV.
Hi, I'm David Shearman. Welcome back to Politically Speaking. My guests today are Dave Trumble, who is Vice President for Bruce County for the Grey Bruce Labour Council, and Chris Stephen, who is Vice President for the Grey Bruce Labour Council. And I inadvertently promoted Chris in my intro at the top of the show, but that's okay, isn't it, Chris?
Oh, that's fine. I'm sure Kevin won't mind.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, we were talking about the numbers, the statistics, and Dave, you made a very good point just before we came back. Is that while the numbers of acute incidents is probably small, and that's probably due to the work that you have done through your lifetime in terms of industrial safety and accident prevention. There's a lot of the term that they use sometimes is collateral damage, but it's long-term effects of things like workplace exposure. We've seen that in particular groups like firefighters who have got some very, very strange diseases that they often fall to for a variety of reasons, or some of the industrial workers exposed to certain chemicals. And over a lifetime, it's an accumulating exposure. How much is that a part of the day of mourning?
Well, if you look at the sort of the taglines that often go with day of mourning, the idea of mourn for the dead, fight for the living. That's all about being respectful and recommitting ourselves to doing the right thing to prevent future injuries and illnesses. But when we talk of day of mourning, we always talk about it on 3 particular pillars: those that have been killed, those that have been injured, and those that have been made sick in their workplace or because of their workplace. And it is those that have been made sick that may or may not manifest a symptom for decades that we also have to count in those statistics. And that's where we go from that number of, between 50 and 100 who have succumbed to a workplace injury in an acute manner, to about 1 a day when we calculate and integrate those that are dying as a result of exposure to chemicals or things like asbestos, which is almost in everybody's lexicon.
Sure. And I think that the exposure factor is something that we kind of sinks into the background because it's often cumulative. I suspect if someone went and looked at my teeth, they would discover that I grew up during the atomic testing age because I've got a certain amount of strontium-90 in my body. And they would know that simply by examination, probably a pretty deep examination. And hopefully it will not occur while I'm living, but you never know. But my point is simply that there are people, there's a lot of people who are exposed to stuff that is particularly nasty and, 20, 30 years ago was not understood to be particularly nasty. So we've got, Chris, you probably have worked with over your life with, or your predecessors in municipal work have worked with paints, pesticides, those kinds of things which we now know are not good things.
Oh, for sure. Like I remember when I first started back for Aaron Elderslie, we would spray all the sidewalks with pesticides in the summer to make sure the weeds didn't come up through the cracks. So I did that every summer. And you always paint in the summer. Like we always got stuff that needs to be touched up and painted, or snow equipment so that it doesn't rust over the summer. That stuff all happens. So now we got things like WHMIS that really, helps us understand what we're dealing with, how to treat it if we have something harmful, and just how to be safe with it overall, what equipment that we need and precautions to take. So it's vitally important to have those kinds of trainings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, Dave, you've had the same kind of experience in your work with power workers. Although electricity is a given, there are still some pretty toxic things. And if you work at Bruce Power, I'm sure the nuclear safety is absolutely critical.
It is. Well, I mean, if you look at the 5 values of Bruce Power, their first value is safety first. So I mean that is the heritage, the DNA of the organization, and thankfully, they do live up to that value. I remember, my early days when I came into the nuclear side of the business, and you do extensive, occupational radiation protection training. And one of the first quotes out of the instructor was, he said, "I know you guys are going to take this serious, but for those of you who don't think it's serious, I wish that I could somehow make it so that every time you are exposed to radiation in your occupation, that it would sting you, that you would know that it's taking place. Then you might pay attention." Obviously, we all recognize that we have to be very careful around any hazard, whether it be occupational radiation, or whether it be, as Chris has described, pesticides, etc. But I thought his message was clear. Just because you can't smell it, just because you can't see it, doesn't mean that it's not taking its toll on you.
That's right. That's right. And we see the commercials for industrial lawsuit claims down in the States, particularly asbestos, because there was a whole industry of shipbuilding industry that used asbestos as an insulator and as a sound deadener. And the workers who installed that stuff surprisingly are dying. Unsurprisingly are dying because they breathe that stuff in, and it caused lung cancer.
Canada and Ontario in particular, if you look at the WSIB, the Workplace Safety Insurance Board, which of course was the Workmen's Compensation Board for many decades, it's often called the Grand Compromise. It removes the ability of a worker to sue their employer for exposure to things like asbestos, but it insures, or it's supposed to ensure, an income in the event that a person is injured or made sick. And that is the Grand Compromise. And when it works well, that's exactly how it's supposed to function.
Sure. Now, when we talk about people's injuries, one of the things we perhaps don't remember or remember less of is and perhaps I think it's worth lifting up on this day of mourning in this conversation, is the effect on families, the widows and widowers, the children. And is there any acknowledgement of those victims as well?
Chris?
Oh, for sure. We recognize that an accident, injury, anything relating to the workplace has long-term effects on every member of the family. For every worker that's killed, he might be a brother, a son, grandpa, because it doesn't discriminate. Whatever happens in the workplace happens, and it doesn't discriminate on who you are, and it happens. But that affects their families, their friends. I have seen it firsthand. We had a death within 255 a few years ago in Brody Schwartz. I've seen how that affected his coworkers. I didn't know him personally, but I seen how it affected his coworkers, his family, all that stuff. And it's tough. It is really, really tough. And you actually get yourself that you don't know what to say that's comforting. I guess all you can do is be there. So we got to learn from these things and move forward, but it is very, very tough. And we want all the families to know that our heart goes out to them on that day. And it's not just the ones that are killed. It's the ones that are sick because their family members have to take care of them. And the ones that are injured, once again, there's family responsibility there.
Sure. We've talked a bit about COVID over the course of the program, but let's zero in on some of that for a moment, because I think that it is certainly a very important topic. And we don't know what impact it is going to have on worker health, long-term health. And but I have to say that it is disturbing to see the stories that are coming out in the media of well, there is one right now, I think in the Toronto Star, of an ICU nurse who was absolutely devastated because she has just dealt with so much death. And these are not unusual stories. We have stories of doctors who are feeling the stress and the strain. We have stories of all people who are really, really struggling. And are you seeing that in your work as well? Are the unions addressing some of these issues? I'm going to call it coping with COVID among workers.
Maybe I'll take a piece of that. I think this is really important for Chris to talk about, because I know QP has been front and center on the paid sick days and on the long-term care. But if I can take a little piece of that, what we're witnessing is COVID fatigue. And that doesn't mean that we're all just tired of COVID, which we all are. But every worker goes to work, and they have the cancers didn't stop, the motor vehicle accidents didn't stop, the electrocutions didn't stop. So now they go into the workplace having to protect themselves and their coworkers for all those things they had to protect themselves from pre-COVID, as well as protect themselves and their coworkers from COVID. So they basically doubled the burden, the mental and stress burden of looking out for each other and themselves in the environment. And we know that that is having an impact from time to time. I had one individual, kind of a strange work situation. They had to wear a half face comfort respirator to do their work, among several other pieces of personal protective equipment. Well, they were wearing their paper surgical mask. So they dressed entirely in all the right gear, and in their mind's eye, they were fully dressed. And they walked into the environment with no proper respiratory protection. All they had on was their surgical mask. They got about 10 feet in the door and realized they'd made this error. So, it was kind of a very lucky situation. There was probably no harm, no foul in it. But if it had been, for instance, a confined space where there had been a requirement for something to prevent them from some toxic environment, this could have easily been a fatality. So that COVID fatigue is a big piece, but I know that Chris has got a lot to say on the certainly the healthcare front and the QP front.
Well, sure do. Let's start with the paid sick days part of it. So I know for us personally, we've had guys not come to work because they've got a cold and they stay at home, but we're lucky enough that we have negotiated sick days in our contract. We get paid to stay at home, and we don't have to have that fear of going to work and infecting our coworkers, because we have the opportunity to stay home, make sure we get better. And if we aren't getting better, we have the opportunity to test and still get paid for it using our sick days. So many workers in this country do not have that benefit. So they're going to work with symptoms, not knowing if they have it or not, and infecting many people around them. This is where paid sick days are crucial to move forward in every workplace. And you know what? That's why unions are important, because they fight for these things. And they don't just fight for union workers, they fight for every single person in this country, because we are all workers except for that 1% at the top. So it's huge importance to make sure these people have the opportunity to stay at home so they don't infect their coworkers, because this disease spreads faster than things like the flu and a cold. You come into it, you infect everybody. If you infect everybody with a flu, everybody's going to take a few days off and be back to work. But you don't know how anybody's going to react. And then we look at the long-term care aspect of it. And I know QP's been huge in this front, trying to get a long-term, and they have been for years. Pre-COVID, QP's been fighting for 4 hours of mandatory care for every person in a long-term care home, benefits for the workers and wages for the workers. But we were talking about statistics before, and I want you to think about this one. I looked this up this morning while I was on the QP site. 4 out of 5 COVID-19 related deaths in Canada have either been residents or staff of a long-term care home. It's the worst record in the developed world. That's all I needed to read on that one. They need to be public held, number ones. Privately funded home care facilities have been proven in this situation that they are not adequate. publicly funded, benefits for the workers, and proper health and safety for the workers. It's vitally important. Like I said, that statistic is boggling to me.
And you know, David, maybe just one thing I just add for some context. I mean, we're so fortunate to have the ability for Chris to speak, you know, so eloquently about QP. But you know, Unifor is in on that fight. SEIU is in on that fight. You know, it's every single collective bargaining agent that can see their way through because they've been directly affected, or they see it as the moral and ethical thing to do, continues in that fight.
Yes, I think you make a very valid point. It crosses the union boundaries. It crosses. It's an aspect of every single working person's life these days. Doesn't matter whether you're even in retail or you know, working in a warehouse. This COVID protection is absolutely essential, and these things are an issue. It will be interesting to see what happens post-COVID as we begin to move forward and out of things, in terms of, for example, national home care standards, which will probably be a couple of years in negotiation, but you know, hopefully the unions will have a part of that, at least a part of that be a part of that conversation, and you know, I think it's really important that we keep those standards in mind, that workers have to be safe, because as we've seen, they're not, or they weren't. We've been very lucky here in Bruce and Grey because we've had a relatively low incidence of outbreaks in long-term care. Nothing like they had down in the GTA, nothing at all, or even in Barrie. But that doesn't mean we should be any less vigilant at all.
And I think perhaps I could also share another situation where we've actually seen a couple of cases where an infection has taken place in the workplace, and that particular individual come home, has been waiting for results of testing, has tested positive, and in fact has infected another member of the family, and the family has succumbed to the illness.
Yeah. It does appear, just talk about mandatory sick days or sick pay for a moment, it does appear there is some movement on that front, although I suspect it, you know, it will be a turtle-like movement, but there does appear to be some movement, at least at the provincial and perhaps the federal level, to try and move that forward.
Perhaps I can share with you the one of the funny things I saw on social media today. It was a reminder that with the pushback against paid sick days, today is Doug Ford's third day on paid sick days.
That is very, very true. That is very, very true. Point well taken, Dave. Well taken. And it at the same time, you know, you have outbreaks in places like Amazon or even Canada Post, where there'd be 200 or 300 cases, and you know, one would hope that there has been no permanent damage to workers, but you never can tell. You never can tell.
I appreciate Chris bringing up the National Safety Council statistics from the U.S. One of the greatest privileges I have in my labor involvement, obviously Labor Council and my own union, but I'm also a big part of the labor division for the National Safety Council, and they do bring it home. You know, they're one of the past chairs of the labor division worked in shipbuilding, you know, and he said, I just want to remind you that we've had 8 fatalities in our facility.
Yes, and while we've been very, in Grey Bruce, we kind of think we're in a bit of an insular bubble. I have friends, and I'm sure you have friends in the GTA or family in the GTA, where it's a very, very different reality, and people are actually quite anxious, quite worried. If there is an upside to COVID, it is that we are moving forward with vaccination. I know I've had my shot. My wife had her shot today, and I think we both agreed that there was a general atmosphere of relief. Mm-hmm. That, you know, okay, we're partially protected at this point, but we're not out of the woods yet at all.
Yes, I was fortunate to have my first shot just over a week ago. And, there was some difficulty with some internet connections and people got backed up. But you know what? It was probably the first time in a year that I'd seen people feel like they were in a celebratory mood.
I agree. And Chris, no disrespect to you if you have not had your shot yet.
I get it tomorrow morning.
Ah, good man.
I'm looking forward to it. It will bring such a sigh of relief to me as well. I can't even tell you how nervous I've been. I'm very careful when I go out of the house. But along with that comes, you were talking about how we've been regular or kind of isolated here in Grey Bruce, to put it simply. Well, along with that, we've also become complacent. And that's another thing with the workplace, even around COVID, but around a lot of things. If you get away with something once, it doesn't mean you're going to get away with it 50 times. And we do become complacent in the workplace, which is another thing we should focus on, is refreshing and making sure you're up to date on your health and safety and making sure you're doing things the right way. Because just because you get away with it once doesn't mean you're going to get away with it 5 times.
You know what, Chris? I wonder if we should maybe just mention, we've talked about sort of day of mourning and labor, and there's a bit of a thread to connecting them all. I would like to suggest too that one of the biggest helpers, mitigators with respect to COVID or anything in our workplace has been those people in workplaces that stick their hand up and say, I will sit on a joint health and safety committee. Whether it's the worker members or if they're committed employer members, I don't care what hat you wear. Those people have staved off, illness and death in a pre-COVID world more times than we'll ever know. And they've staved off illness and death in the COVID world. And, those health and safety committees exist because, workers in Elliott Lake, basically made the Occupational Health and Safety Act happen. And we reap the benefit of it, 40 some years later.
And Elliott Lake was, if I recall, that was a uranium mine.
That is correct. And if any of your listeners ever want to spend 7 minutes of quality time, go look at the United Steelworkers video called "Remembering Elliott Lake." It tells the story and it connects so well to what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. And it tells the story of the Elliott Lake miners who had to fight for recognition of their conditions, as I recall.
And in fact, they walked off the job, not for money, not for sick time, not for benefits, for one thing and one thing only: recognition that they were dying in the workplace.
Yeah. And that dying, they were mining uranium, and the same thing was said in World War II. In the mines in Northwest Territories, the uranium and radium, which was mined to help the U.S. nuclear program, and people were dying, and they were indigenous miners too, so it was kind of poo-pooed, but son of a gun, it was a little more serious than that. So this whole thread, goes back many years. But I think that I was just I'm a great history fan, and I do a lot of reading of some of the industrial history, and I'm thinking of the railroads especially. And there's another story of workplace safety and how the unions brought forward huge changes in the workplace. In many cases, they were fought tooth and nail by the employers, by the railways. But I remember one story that this was, I think, pre-union, that because of course there was no pensions, and when a man, it was men then, was injured on the job, basically he and his family could be put out of their house because it was a company house. But what they did, and this was very early in American labor history, was they would put a jar beside in the scheduling office, and the people as they went by, the train crews as they went by, would be asked to put something in to help the widow and to help with funeral expenses. Well, that was, I understand, one of the reasons for formation of the railroad unions, which actually did a lot of good. but they all knew the moment they saw the jar, the can, someone had died. And we're very fortunate. That's a distant memory for most of us.
There is some great advocacy groups. I'm not actually a member of it, but I actually see it come up regularly because of my association with the Labor Division at the National Safety Council, and it's an organization that does exactly the same thing when a lineman is killed on the job, and they are able now, of course, through social media to do GoFundMes, and that's exactly the role that they undertake, David.
Yeah. I think it's a remarkable place we've come from and where we are, but it's a reminder that there's still a lot of work yet to be done. And if the National Day of Mourning can be that, it's both looking back but also looking forward.
It's the mourn for the dead, fight for the living. It's as if you knew that was the right thing to say as we're coming to the end of our interview.
Well, I think that we've got a lot. We've got a place to go. And actually, I will make a point of being in my truck and out on that 28th when the flag is flying here at Owen Sound, at least to pay my respects, because it's something that we can do, and even if we're just surfing the web and doing a little. Or watching a video on it. It's something that we can all do on this day, just to remind ourselves of the debt we owe to those who have gone before, and to make sure that people continue to be safe in the days ahead.
Very much so.
I agree.
Now, for the both of you, will there be anything, Dave? You've already said that you're doing a special commemoration at Bruce Power. Chris, will there be anything special that you'll be doing on that day?
With social distancing, I am going to meet with the mayor, Steve Hamill, here in Aaron Elderslie, and we are going to, and a couple other workers, and we're going to get some pictures and raise the flag together to commemorate the moment. We didn't want too many people around because that would be, once again, contrary to COVID rules. So we're going to do it socially distance-wise. But that's pretty much all we're going to do. It's the flag in Aaron Elderslie is going to fly at Big Bruce in Chesley. It will be there. They're actually going to fly it for the week to commemorate that. And I do believe, I shouldn't put words in his mouth, I think he's going to do a proclamation that he reads in for us as well. Mayor Hamill has been very supportive in the Aaron Elderslie Council of trying to get on this. And like I said, I encourage other councils in the area, reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to talk to you.
Sure. Well, I want to thank the both of you for being a part of Politically Speaking today. A little bit of a change up in our usual conversation, but it's always good to talk to you both and to recount the National Day of Mourning, the story, and to recognize that the fight is not yet over for worker safety. So thank you both.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you both, and thank you to Rogers for supporting this once again this year. Much appreciated.
All right. And friends, thank you for joining me on this Politically Speaking. I'm David Shearman. We'll talk again.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
So, Dee, what do you do?
I'm a